Okay, so I just wanted to show that this trail is the right direction. So you can see that the compass lines up. So this is the same as that they took back at the fort. And also, I don't know if you noticed, but this is a very nice trail. I don't know if you can see that, but it's quite wide and very well maintained. When the French took over the positions after March the 7th and 8th, at that time, the French Foreign Legion and the Bat Daf were in charge of reconstructing the roads to all these different forts. So it's quite likely that this particular road here was actually widened and made better by the French Foreign Legion. So just kind of a little tidbit. Okay, so here we are. This is Fort Bertin, or part of it anyway. This looks like a very small fort where I'm standing, but is actually much more to the fort. So maybe what I can do is I can show us on a map what this fort looks like. This is the kind of the standard map of Geelong made by Garneau. And you can see here on the map, here's downtown Geelong. We were looking at this earlier. And then this is Fort Danshwe, where we spent our time talking. And then we've walked along this trail, which is about around 900 to 1,000 meters. And now we're at Fort Bertin. So Fort Bertin was actually one of the furthest south of the French forts. So this is the farthest southwest corner of French positions. And you can see it's just right next to the river, just overlooking the river. And then about 2 kilometers east, just a little bit short of 2 kilometers, you can see there's another fort called Fort du Sud, Fort of the South. So this was another fort that the French captured, and it also overlooked the Geelong River. This fort over here was manned by the Bat Daf, and then the fort that we're at right now was actually constructed and manned by the French Foreign Legion. The French Foreign Legion had a company here. So let's have a look at another map that shows even closer. So this map was also drawn by Garneau, and you can see the same thing. Here is Fort Danshwe, and we followed this trail all the way down, and now we're at Fort Bertin. So that's what the fort looks like. So when I first got to this fort and I saw this picture, I was not impressed. I thought, what? This is a very tiny fort. I couldn't imagine this being a fort. And then later I found yet another map which is even closer and shows the detail of this fort. And this map is really great because it shows the detail plan of the fort. And this one was drawn by Second Lieutenant Fritsch. So I did some research and I found out that Second Lieutenant Fritsch was actually a Marine artillery commander, and he was put in charge of this fort after Captain Bertin went back to France. So this all occurred around the end of March. So as you remember, the fort started its construction on the middle of March, and then around March 25th, the French Foreign Legion kind of moved in here. So they were actually constructing this fort, and then they started to move in here with one of their companies. And then at the end of March, that's when the French artillery guys started to move their artillery in here, and that's when they made the change of the commander. So the commander was Second Lieutenant Fritsch. He drew this map, but what's interesting is that this fort was actually designed by a man named Capitaine Joffre. So Joffre, of course, is very famous in France because he was the Marshal of France during World War I. But at this time, during the Tonkin campaign, he was an engineering captain. So he was a kind of an up-and-coming engineering captain with a lot of talent. And he was put in charge of constructing all of the roads and forts after the French beat the Chinese over the river. So when the French settled into these positions, Joffre was kind of organizing all of these roads and forts. So the road that we just came in, that I said the French Foreign Legion probably widened, Joffre would have been in charge of that road construction as well. So there's a lot of interesting history about this fort. And you can see what's interesting about this fort is that it actually matches up well with the Taiwanese modern topographical maps. If you can see, this fort is kind of shaped like a shoe. And then you can see here this Taiwanese topographical map, and we're sitting right here. And you can see this landform is also shaped a bit like a shoe or a foot. So according to the French reports, this was not an easy fort to make. So the legionnaires who were here, they said it was very difficult because they have to make terraces inside this fort for their accommodations, and they had to make positions for the artillery. This was a very difficult fort to construct, but it was very useful. So as you can see, it's right on the edge of the Keelung River, and they can overlook the Chinese positions that were all along this front. Let's just start the tour right here, right in the very top of the fort. So you can see that we're actually at the C position. So this is the C position, very top of the fort. It's interesting, it's still here. You can see that it's still roughly the same shape. But the most interesting part, I think, is the fact right here. So you can see that we actually came in through the top. So the modern trail to come into this fort is right over the top of the fort, right into the fort as we came. But you can see carefully that that was not the original entrance of the fort in 1885. The entrance to this fort was on the side. So the French actually built their trail on the inner side of the hill. And that makes a lot of sense. Even though like modern hikers will find it more comfortable to walk along the ridge and we come into the top of the fort, the French didn't want the Chinese to see them. So I'm imagining that's why they put the trail on the side, so the Chinese cannot observe them coming and going on the inside of the ridge. So the other interesting thing about the top of this fort is that actually there were two photographs taken from the top of this fort. There was a French photographer who came here, and he took a shot to the east towards Nuan Nuan, and he took another shot to the west towards Badu along the Keelung River. Unfortunately, these two photographs cannot be found, so they've gone missing and everybody's looking for them. But fortunately, back in the 1890s when Garneau wrote his book, he had a bunch of illustrations. And then a French illustrator actually saw these photos and he drew a sketch based on these photos. So we have these two sketches. So here's the first sketch that he did, and this one is towards Nuan Nuan. And then because nowadays there's a lot of bamboo and you can see there's trees around, it's almost impossible to get the same view that he had when he took the photo. But if you pop up a drone, you can actually see, you can get exactly the same type of shot towards Nuan Nuan. And then the other shot, which is also very famous, is this shot here, taken again from the top of Fort Bertin. And this time he took the photo, this is towards modern Badu. And you can see that Badu back in the 1880s was just basically rice fields. This again was a great photo. And yes, if you pop the drone up and you also face towards Badu, you can get exactly the same view that he had. So that's kind of an interesting feature of the top of this fort. Okay, so before we take our tour of the rest of the fort, actually the one last thing I should say about this top here is when I first came here, and I think a lot of people when they first come to this first top of the fort, they think it's obvious that this is where the French had their artillery, right? Because you're at the very top and you can see everywhere. But actually when you look carefully at the French map made by Fritsch, they didn't have the artillery at this position, but they did choose this next position. Let's go to position B, and this is where they had their artillery. So this is the position B on the map, and you can see that he drew two openings for these guns. So for example, here's one here, and then he's got another one facing down this way. So originally Fort Bertin was supposed to have quite a few artillery guns. Like they were actually going to have like maybe 3 or 4 guns or more at this position, but it's actually very hard to transport this artillery from Fort Danshui. So in the end, they finally settled on what we see in the map here. They have two 80 millimeter mountain guns. So these are very, very accurate and effective over long ranges, like 2 kilometers at least. And they could take out most of the Chinese positions with great accuracy. And they also had one number 4 cannon. So this was a mountain gun. It was much smaller. And they would probably use this one for closer action. If the Chinese decided to attack, they could shoot them with case shot or what have you. But these smaller mountain cannons were also very, very accurate over distances of up to 500 or 1,000 meters. So the French, even though they only had 3 cannons here, they were very, very well protected in addition to the French Foreign Legion Company. So let's have a look at the rest of the fort and we'll see how it matches with the map. According to the map of this fort, the main artillery position was actually right here. There looked like there are probably walls here at some point. Those are gone. And then this area was flattened and it has positions for 3 guns. What I find interesting about this map is that they indicate that there was 2 80 millimeter mountain cannon and 1 number 4 cannon, but they have actually got positions for 5. My sense is that they may have had positions for 5 in case they bring in more artillery, or they would simply move the cannons around as necessary. For if the Chinese are attacking from one side, they would move the cannons there and so forth. But in any case, the map indicates that this area was cut out kind of as like a small diamond for 3 guns. We can't see it now because of the trees and the bamboo, but if you cut down all the trees and all the bamboo, and I'm sure the French did that, they would have perfect sight directly south of all of the Chinese positions on the west and south side. And as I said, these cannons were super accurate, so the Chinese were, of course, very, very careful to keep their distance. So next to this area, you can see there's actually an entrance to the fort. So let's have a look and see what's inside the fort, and we'll go there now. So you can see here is the entrance to the fort, and so this was where they had their first level of accommodation. So let's kind of cut in here, and probably the first most interesting thing in this area is you can see that there's like a little cave that's straight ahead of me here. And on the French map, they indicate that this is where they put their ammunition. So I remember when I first came here, I didn't know what this was. I was trying to figure out, is that where they had campfires or whatever? But no, they were actually smarter than that. And they actually, that's where they put all their artillery shells, etc. So they don't get blown up, right? They don't want to keep their artillery out in the open. And then if the Chinese happen to hit it, then the whole fort's going to explode. So that's kind of a smart thing. And so you can see that this area is kind of flattened. It's hard to say what they had in this area. They don't really mark it, but I'm sure they had different supplies and what have you in this kind of area. But if we walk a little bit further, now we're at this position A on the map, and there's a definite wall here. And this smaller area is where they would have their tents. Now my guess is, and I could be totally wrong, but since this is the top of the fort and they've got a definite barrier here, like a protected enclosure, I'm guessing that this may have been where the officers were housed. Could be wrong, but just my guess is that they had a very small number of tents here, and this is where it was. Could have been the hospital, could have been any number of people, but that's just my guess. Okay, so another interesting thing about this fort is when I first came here, many times actually, I thought that this was the fort. I thought, okay, well, it's not bad, it's fair size. And then when I came across this map, I found out that actually this fort is much, much bigger. And it has actually 2 more layers to the fort. And so you can see here, they've got it marked as position A again. I guess these are for the tents. And if you can just sort of follow me down, you can see there's a layer right beneath me here where it's all flattened. And this is where they also had tents. You can see that they kind of carved it out. It doesn't look as flat as it would have been in 1885, but you can generally see here where they would have had some tents, and it was probably a lot flatter and wider, but after we've had so many typhoons, it's not so flat. But this would be the second level. We were on the first level. This is the second level. Okay, so here's the third level of the fort. This is the lowest level. And you can see on the map, the second level is connected to the third level with a little ramp. I will actually climb down on the ramp. You can actually see the ramp is still here, and then it leads into a much flatter, bigger space below. So I'm going to go down to level H, and then we'll talk about it when I get there. Okay, so this is the kind of the lowest level, and it's like the largest. So I'm imagining that, you know, most of the infantry, most of the French Foreign Legion were probably camped here. And it says in French, casse can be translated into like a hut, like a straw hut, or some kind of local dwelling. So from that description, I'm guessing that what the French had here, as opposed to the tents above, is down here they had a series of bamboo huts. And because there was a lot of legionnaires here, by the sounds of it, they could have been up to 200 or 300 or more guys here. That's a lot of guys. And even though this is quite a wide space, but I still have trouble imagining 300 guys here. But I've seen some drawings and some indication that some of their huts actually had multi-levels. So it's possible that they had, you know, single level and multi-leveled bamboo huts down here for the men. They probably had long bamboo huts, and they might have single ones or ones that are stacked on top of each other. But anyway, this is the largest area where the men were camped. Now there is one more feature that I find very interesting, and that is there's also an indication that there is a kitchen. And so I've always been very curious about where this kitchen is. I think it's very hard to find, but maybe we can walk a short distance towards where it might be on the map. It's hard to judge the distances and so forth, but it looks like from the map that, you know, this section H kind of went around in a curve and then ended at some point. And it's hard to tell if they ended with a wall or they ended with a drop. But in any case, this looks like this might be the natural end of the camp area, is right here. So if that's the end of the camp area, then my guess is that somewhere down in this area, maybe about 30 meters, might be the kitchen. Now some people might think that's kind of weird to have a kitchen very, very far away from the camp, but my guess is that they probably had the kitchen where they cook their food far away so they don't get rodents and animals and other creatures kind of invading and infesting their camp. They wanted to keep it as far away as possible. So here I go. I'm just going to take a little walk. Did you find it? Well, I'd like to say yes, but it's not clear. And also I don't want to push my luck because, as you know from last time, we had, you know, a serious hornet attack in there, in that same area. So I'm just going to let it go. I looked forward, you know, 30, 40 meters. You know, the land kind of undulates and rolls a bit, but I wouldn't say there's anything that I could definitely say looks like a kitchen. So let's leave that to another day, or to other explorers who have bee suits, and they can go in there and poke around. Okay, so now we come to my favorite part of the fort, and it's just right over here. It's easily missed. I missed it for a long time, and then suddenly I found it, and I hope you find it as interesting as I do. So let's check it out. So as you can see on the map, there's actually a very, very long trench that they created to a lookout position. I like it because the trench is still very, very well preserved, even after many typhoons and earthquakes and so forth. So it's a very long trench, so let's see where it goes. So one interesting thing that I have found about this particular trench, and also a number of other French trenches that I have seen up here, is that the French often built their trench line right on the top of a ridge so that they can see both sides. So you can see that this trench was looking this way, you know, and this trench was looking this way. So they're looking both east and west at the same time because they don't know where the Chinese are going to attack from. So if you go up in the hills and whatever and you find some French positions, you'll find that they often do that. They'll put it right in the middle and then you can see both sides. The Chinese, on the other hand, they tended to put their trenches on one side. So they tended to put their trench where they're facing the enemy, right? Because they don't expect the enemy to come behind them. So they'll build the trench more towards this way. Not always, sometimes they're in the middle. It's something to notice why they would put it on the middle of the ridge and not on one side. It's because they're expecting the Chinese to attack from multiple positions. Now, one thing that should be noted is that even though this trench is in great condition, I believe that it was much, much deeper than this even. So, because remember, the Chinese were nearby and they're shooting at the French all the time. So they would want to have this trench over their heads. But still, it's quite amazing that we still have the trench shaped like this. So we're almost there. So let me take you to the end. And so here's the end of the trench, which is, as you can see, it's an observation post, probably for about 5 or 6 guys, maybe more. They would have, you know, basically 180, 270 degree view of the Chinese positions. Anyway, this is kind of my favorite part. And this is also a good part to kind of finish the history about this fort and what happened with the campaign. At the end of March and then into April, kind of the beginning of April, end of March, that's when there was a lot of battles with the Chinese artillery in the hills. So the French and the Chinese would exchange artillery shots, both on the west side and also on the east side. And yeah, the French were very, very accurate. They could pick out the Chinese positions. They'd have to roll their guns away. But as the campaign rolled on into April, the French noticed that the Chinese were getting much, much better with their artillery, and they were able to pick off Fort Bertin very, very well. So for example, there was one shot coming from a Chinese position near Chidu, and this was almost 2 kilometers away, which landed inside Fort Bertin and blew up an officer's hut. And according to the French, fortunately, there was no one inside the hut at the time. I'm estimating that the hut may have been near the wall partition that we saw in the interior of the fort earlier. So the French were quite alarmed. They're like, oh my God. And then they found out later, and they thought this is probably true, is that one of the French deserters, either Bat Daf or maybe a legionnaire, somebody who had artillery experience, went over to the Chinese side, and he was expertly guiding them with their artillery. Because for most of the campaign, the Chinese artillery was, the guns were fantastic. They were Krupp German mountain guns with tremendous accuracy, but the Chinese were not well trained. They couldn't quite manage these guns. But right at the very end, they could zero in on the French positions. And so fortunately for the French, the campaign ended. So April rolled on onto April 17th, and then that was an armistice. So both the Chinese and the French in Formosa, everybody agreed no more shooting. So the shooting had actually stopped. That was the end of the hostilities. Also, the armistice occurred earlier in Tonkin. So the fighting in Tonkin had also had a ceasefire. This one had a later ceasefire. And then from April until June 21st, so quite a long time, it was a few months, the French just sat here and they just looked at the Chinese across the river. The Chinese looked back at the French, and everybody's digging and watching each other, but nobody actually fired any shots. So that's basically kind of how this fort ended. The Chinese during that time, even before the armistice, never attacked this position. They didn't dare, right? It was too well defended. They did shoot here quite a lot of times, and there were a couple of French soldiers who were wounded, but nobody was killed. So yeah, there's no real battles that occurred here at this site, but certainly they had their artillery exchanges. So everything finally came to an end on June 21st. As I said, that was the final day. Everybody agreed the French are going to leave Geelong. So all of the fort areas in Geelong, they all left like one by one. They had a schedule of when they're going to leave. The outer forts would leave earlier. As I recall from my research, Fort Bertin, they kind of left early in the morning and they took all their cannons and guys, and then they went down to the ships. But they had also been kind of demobilizing for a couple of weeks. So it wasn't like they had all this equipment and they're carrying all this heavy equipment down there. They had been planning this evacuation for many weeks, and they had also been slowly taking stuff out. So I imagine that on the last day they're just kind of sweeping up and taking a few things with them, and then they left. And so both sides, the Chinese and the French governments, everybody agreed, okay, this is the end of the hostilities. And now they had to kind of finally finish how this whole conflict would end. So as you recall, Formosa and the Pescadores, these were bargaining ships, right? They're trying to get the Chinese to cooperate. And so finally, both sides agreed, okay, this is how we're going to do it. So the French left Formosa, Taiwan, Geelong, and then the Chinese took that back on June 21st. The Chinese then evacuated the rest of Tonkin by the end of June, so that was completed. And then the final step, which was near the end of July, is the French finally left the Pescadores. So the Pescadores were finally left to the Chinese and they came back. Everything was done. Complete waste of time, complete waste of money, complete waste of lots of thousands of lives. Because they go right back to the beginning again. So right back to the before 1884, and there was no war. They fought for nothing, just for pride. And fortunately, both governments came to their senses, and that was the end. So that's basically the history of this fort, and it actually was the end of the campaign as well.
So according to what you told me, your research was based on French resources. Did you also check the Chinese resources?
Well, when I first started with this research, and I'm up here in the hills and that, my original intention is I wanted to find both sides. So yes, I did check the Chinese sources, but unfortunately, they are very, very few. So I did find journals from Liu Mingchuan, and I went to the National Taiwan University Library, and I looked at them, I've read them. Not myself, I can't read them, but I had people translate them for me. Unfortunately, these journals from him were actually sent to the Empress of China directly. These are reports to the Empress. These were not military reports. These were more like, she wants to know what's going on, and he's writing stuff, and it's not clear. There wasn't like a lot of accurate detail about what was going on. There was just no way to compare or to understand from the Chinese point of view. So instead, I thought, well, I'm just going to look at one side that has a lot of information from different sources that I can cross-reference. So there was a lot of different French soldiers who talked about the same thing. So I thought if I can get these different guys to talk about the same thing, I can probably get closer to the truth. So no, my intention was to look at the Chinese sources, but I think it requires a lot of research, and I think scholars would have to do that.
I think I have read some Taiwanese stories. They suggest that the French had to leave Formosa because they're defeated by the Chinese. What do you think about that?
Well, actually the truth is kind of mixed. So certainly if you're only focusing on Geelong, the story that I told you seems fairly accurate from how I've researched it. Because again, I've checked many different French sources, and they all say the same thing. And the French seem very, very open about when they lost. You know what I mean? Like there were battles that the French lost, and they were very honest about that, right? So, and they also were very honest about how many guys were killed and how miserable it was and the mistakes they made. So I think the French sources were pretty accurate and trustworthy here in Geelong. The French made very big mistakes in Tonkin. Especially there's a battle that people can read about. It's called Lang Son. So it's kind of the later battle of Lang Son. And the French made a disastrous show there. They were actually winning the battle when one of their commanders ordered them to retreat. And everybody was confused. And the French retreated. The Chinese actually won that battle. They shouldn't have. And that actually caused a collapse in the French confidence. So the French lost a lot of confidence from that episode. And it created a huge political problem in France. So everybody said, this is stupid, we have to end the war. And so they decided to end the war because of this incident. So everything kind of went from there. But to say that the Chinese beat the French in Geelong and they pushed them out because they beat them, I don't think that's accurate. It's accurate to say that the Chinese, in the very end, did very well in Tonkin. They did push the French towards a peace treaty because the French made such stupid mistakes at the very end. And I think everybody would agree with that. And then the French government was overthrown. So the French leader, Jules Ferry, he lost the confidence of everybody, and so the government changed. The Chinese, the Qing government, was very happy to have peace because they were in great debt. They lost tremendous resources on this campaign. So both sides were exhausted. Both sides were very happy to get the peace back again. So to say that one side was better than the other, I'm not sure that we can make that conclusion. But before we leave, actually there is one more thing that I wanted to say about this fort, and it's actually not about the French Fort Bertin, but it is something on the map that I found kind of very interesting, and it led me to think about something else. So if we look at position C, C says, very interestingly, it says Ancienne Casse Chinoise. In French, that could be translated into English as an ancient Chinese, you could say hut or dwelling or position. And so that made me think about the word ancient, because when the French say that, that means it wasn't here just recently. It's kind of like a bit long ago. And there's a couple of things that this makes me think. So first of all, it's not accurate to say that this was originally a French fort. You can't say that, because at least part of it was Chinese. The Chinese had a part of the fort before the French came. They saw it, and then they built the rest of the fort with the legionnaires. That's true. So I would say it's mostly French Foreign Legion built, but not entirely. This section at the top, which was identified as the French as ancient Chinese. So that made me wonder, like, who would be at this position? Why would the Chinese be here? I can understand why the French were here. They wanted to see across the river that way, but it got me thinking, who would be interested to have this position in the same way the French did, to look across at the river activity? So this made me wonder. I was wondering, well, how ancient could it be? Could it be like 10 years, 20 years? And I thought, it's possible that it might be 300 years before, and it could have been during the Dutch time. So I have a theory, again, it's just a guess, I'm not saying it is true, but I think there is a little bit of evidence pointing to the fact that this position may very well have been originally a Dutch observation post that's overlooking the river to see activity. I have some evidence and some ideas that I will present, and I think it's better to go back to Fort Danshui because the evidence is actually there, and then we can talk more about my theory.